Greetings. It's been a long time. I've kind of let this channel go a little dormant, unfortunately. There's been a lot of changes going on, life changes recently. And I've just kind of neglected this because I've been working on other things. But I wanted to jump on here and, what an appropriate topic to get back to than, I can't think of a more appropriate topic than one of the oldest stories, most famous stories ever told, and one that has come to inform philosophy and storytelling and creativity for the past 2,500, 3,000 years, however you want to put the history, and talk about Christopher Nolan's film version of Homer's Odyssey. I didn't know if I wanted to see this movie. I have read the book. It's been a while. I don't remember the details. I remember the images that they conjured. I've dealt with a lot of the subject matter in writings that I've done and studying that I've done. Obviously, if you read Plato, if you read Aristotle, if you read any really what we would call the continental philosophers, the Odyssey is very widely referenced. And, this is a period of time in Greek history where, kind of the old world and the new world are coming together. You've got an oral culture becoming a written culture. You have a period of time when mythology is giving way to a new science. So you've got all these transformations going on. Obviously, you've got the what is regarded as, the early stages of recorded philosophy. And there's a lot of reference to Homer. And there's a lot of reference to the Iliad, obviously, and the Odyssey. And so this is a pretty monumental undertaking for a filmmaker to do. There's been other adaptations, and it's almost impossible to film. And I know we've heard that story, oh, it's impossible to film. It really is difficult because it is an epic, and it defined the idea of what we call an epic. And so that's no small task, just conceptually. It's an epic, and it's hard to do in a single film without it seeming like a series of set pieces or just a series of little adventures in one big adventure. So this is the epic nature of the film, and we have a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, whose ego is big enough and his budget is big enough to match his ego in order for him to do something like this. And I appreciate the ambition. I should say that I'm not a fan of Christopher Nolan's films. I enjoy, one of my favorite movies is one of his, Memento. I think that's a fantastic film. It's a very narrow film. It's a very subjective film, obviously. It's very creative. It's mind-blowing, for the time that it came out. I like The Prestige. I thought that was a good movie. So these are both early films of his. I enjoyed the first Batman movie just because of what it was. But that movie started a theme for me that continued, and it's this, that you watch one of his films and you think, oh, you leave the theater and, you're going down the escalator and you're thinking about it, and, it leaves thoughts in your head. But then, at least for me, I come around to realize that the thoughts I'm having are not as profound as they were presented in the film. The Batman films kind of showed me, and it especially came to fruition in the third film, that Nolan seems to be preserving something, rather than inventing something. And I think what he's preserving is, so if we take the third Batman film, which is Bane, and he is, what is the end of the film? Well, let's reestablish the stock market. Let's reestablish the power regime that was there to start the film. And the first Batman movie did that too. What does Batman do? He reasserts the legitimacy of the regime in power, which is the normal regime. Now, you could say that's democracy, but it seems like what he's really preserving is capitalism. And I think this is a point that Zizek made at some point as well. And then we get to movies like Inception. And Inception I saw, and I was like, wow, that's incredible. But then again, I'm leaving the theater and going, well, that was actually kind of dumb. Like, there was a lot of talking, a lot of explaining in order to get through this movie. And all of that explaining didn't really amount to very much other than trying to explain the structure that Nolan himself had built, and rather than some idea about humanity. And then we get to Interstellar, which to me, I'm just, at this point, I'm just losing interest. It's trying to do something very profound that just isn't very profound. He's trying to do his synthesis of Terrence Malick and Stanley Kubrick, and I think failing on both accounts. I think what started to happen with Nolan over time, so post-Memento Prestige era, he starts to try to do something meaningful. And he starts to do something on ethics and trying to make statements on love and ethics. And when it comes to love and ethics, he just can't do it. I find him to be I find his films to just be soulless. They lack a soul. I see that he's trying to do something, but I sense a person who is not very empathetic, a person who is not in touch with his feelings, and I just don't feel anything from his movies. But yet I keep watching because they're such big budget films that you can't ignore them. And I know he's a filmmaker of big ideas, so I go there just to see the spectacle. And I'm all for big ideas, but I always leave his films feeling empty. So I'm wondering why this is, and I'm going to give you an example of why I think this is. And I'm going to use Aristotle as an example. So Aristotle's Poetics, which is, the work that is attributed to him that deals with Greek tragedy. And the Odyssey is an epic, it's not a tragedy. But Aristotle does deal with epics as well. He's mostly focusing on tragedy. But Aristotle's Poetics is quite literally the playbook on how to tell a story. And I think the more literary filmmakers in Hollywood and elsewhere read Aristotle's Poetics because it still upholds everything that films try to do and stories try to do. And so I have to assume that Nolan has read Aristotle's Poetics. Maybe he hasn't, but it is Hollywood's Bible for how to tell a story. Okay, so I wonder, does Nolan understand that for Aristotle, spectacle, which is what he specializes in, spectacle, is the very bottom of Aristotle's 6 elements of tragedy. So number 1 for Aristotle is plot, or the Greek word is mythos. So what's the myth? What's the story that's being told? And how are you telling it? How are you constructing it? And it seems to me that Nolan's mythos has stripped Homer of all of its mythology. And I know maybe I'm taking that word too literally, But in Nolan's films, just like so many of these adaptations, there are no gods. I don't know how you do the Odyssey without without the gods. The gods are setting everything in motion. If you want to think about it, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the gods doing battle, and the humans are the instruments, right? So I don't know how you remove that. I think maybe the complexity doesn't allow you to do that. The complexity of trying to do this. Um, so instead, what you're left with in Aristotelian terms is the hero. But the problem in doing that, in focusing on a hero, is that what I found in Nolan's Odyssey is a hero that has been rendered guilt-ridden and impotent. He's literally sexless. There's none of the trickster element. There's none of the humor element that I remember from my reading. There's none of the pride and this is Homer's like, or sorry, Odysseus is like, this is me. I am doing this, right? And there's none of that. There's also no violence in the movie. I know that there is war and there's flashbacks to the Trojan War, but it's all very bloodless. So it's sexless and it's bloodless, and I don't quite understand why. So I understand, obviously, by the end that what Nolan is trying to do is he's trying to do, and others have obviously mentioned this PTSD, kind of guilt-ridden, anti-war kind of thing. If you're turning the Odyssey into an anti-war film, you're making a different movie. And if you're going to do that, great. Why not use the Odyssey as an inspiration, give it another title, and then give it a story about where you're deconstructing the tradition. But I don't think he's intentionally doing that. So I had problems with there. And while I was watching, I tried to let myself go. I always try to let myself go in a movie, and I try not to analyze it too much. But I couldn't do it. The first hour is painful to sit through. The dialogue was awful. And his penchant for exposition and, dare I say, mansplaining is on full display. And I just couldn't. The casting, I don't want to get into this woke shit. I don't want to get into all of that kind of stuff. That debate. I'll just tell you, what I felt. The accents were a problem. The casting was a problem, but not because of the diversity. And I do think that that's weird. If he wants to be faithful to a Greek tradition, I think he should hire Greek actors and have the Greek characters in there. But I'll let that slide. The casting, I had the reasons why I had problems with the casting is that I was recognizing actors. There's Tom Holland, there's Matt Damon, and it's like, oh, is that John Leguizamo? I remember him. And then, what's his name? Bernthal. I can't remember his first name. It's just Bernthal. It's just, I think he played Millennius. Sorry, I have no notes in front of me. I'm just kind of going off the cuff here. But it was just like, like Last Temptation of Christ, for anybody who's seen that movie, Harvey Keitel's character as Judas is like this Brooklyn, he's got this Brooklyn accent going the whole time. Well, this is everybody in the whole movie. And there's a lot of, mommy and daddy, and it's just so painful to watch. And if you're going to do that, do what, Baz Luhrmann did with Romeo and Juliet, and, take away the swords and give people guns, put it in a modern, situation. But Nolan doesn't have that kind of inventiveness. He's going for this Nolan realism, and I'm using air quotes because I don't know how realist he actually. It didn't seem realist to me. With all of this, I realized while I was watching it that I was simply gazing at it, and I think this is a problem I have with Nolan's films. Is I don't immerse myself in his worlds. His cinematographers are, the high budget, high production values. I know he wants to shoot on real locations, which is great. Please don't call him Terrence Malick. He has nothing in common with Terrence Malick. But I do appreciate that he works in real locations. But so I think that the shots look nice, but they're not immersive. I was not immersed in this world. I saw filmmaking. I saw Hollywood actors, and yet it felt like a high school play because of the dialogue, the atrocious dialogue, and the atrocious delivery of dialogue. So I couldn't lose myself in it, and I was just like in this kind of gaze of staring at the screen. And I started anticipating every set piece that was to come, knowing that they're going to come, and wondering how he's going to do it. And, I was thinking. I was thinking about it. And I went in there not wanting to do that. I didn't want to do that. So, it's just kind of funny. I think he took an epic story and he kind of made a soft tragedy, but with a happy ending. It's like, come on, dude. Just, again, call it something else. But as it is, it's just forgettable. And, I came home, I had some dinner, and then I'd forgotten I'd even seen the movie. It was boring and it was forgettable. And that's my impression of the movie. And, I really don't like to attack people. I don't like to attack artists. I know the struggles of making art. I know how much goes into it. I know the cast and crew, give their lives to it. So I'm really hesitant to attack an artist. But the fact that he is so venerated escapes me. And so I feel like I have to be critical. I've mentioned that I think he's got a sympathy problem, but more importantly, I think he's got an empathy problem. Maybe he's sympathetic, but I don't think there's no feeling that translates. I wonder if it's simply that everything Nolan does is about himself. And as he moves through his stages of filmmaking, he's dealing with his self has become a sense of guilt. So what comes out is this attempt at redemption or absolution, which just reinforces this lofty self-regard. And what we find is, as a theme, is a defense of men in powerful positions who reassert their privilege, the privilege of their stature. And I wonder if this is Nolan making a commentary on himself. A man who feels guilty, at the same time lifting up powerful men in powerful positions to reassert the privilege of their stature. Batman does this. Matt Damon's Odysseus does this. I couldn't get through Oppenheimer. I tried to watch it. I watched about a half hour on a flight and I turned it off. I couldn't do it. But I imagine that it's the same thing. He's trying to give Oppenheimer, he's trying to elevate Oppenheimer and redeem him as this great person. I don't know. I didn't see it. But you could go through the various films. I mean, even Memento, he's trying to, his whole mission is to remember himself, right? So it's a lot of men trying to remember themselves and assert their who they were and the privilege and the status of who they are. And I think he masks this, Nolan does, um, behind, kind of contemporary codes of media generated ethics. He props up women and non-whites to serve as his interlocutors for these men. Um, so, I think if before, in his films before, his kind of self-help psychologizing was more implicit, but in the Odyssey, he's commandeered a character who's been copied a billion times, right up to, today's Marvel superheroes. He's commandeered this character as something else than what the tradition has him as. And this something else is a man who just wants to be understood and absolved by the women around him. And I do think there's a cycle of narcissism going on in this. Um, but I suppose this cycle of accumulated guilt and this wish for absolution is a reflection of where men are right now. And maybe from that perspective, it's a movie for our time.